Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Today's talk is about protein and the older athlete, and we will certainly give some definitions about what the older athlete is actually referring to. It's somewhere where we're all heading, unfortunately. Some of us may be there already, and it's certainly not a bad thing. I think with advances in nutrition and certainly exercise, it's all about maximizing not just your lifespan, but probably more importantly, your health span. Because as we age, we want to be able to enjoy it. So today's talk is about protein and the older athlete, very much focused on the myo or the muscle perspective from protein and the benefits of it. So there are obviously lots of other elements to protein ingestion and its effect on the body, but we're being very muscle focused on this talk.
Scott, do you want to make yours full screen? I can still see the tab.
Oh, can you see everything?
Yeah.
It's really annoying. Give me 2 seconds.
Reminder, if you guys have questions, you can put them in the chat as well. I'll be making sure that we can see that.
Can you just see my single screen or can you see everything?
Just that tab, but then all like the titles of the other tabs.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so you're saying that. Okay.
There you go.
There
Perfect.
we go. How's
Perfect.
that? Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. Obviously, my name's Scott. Welcome to anyone who doesn't know me. And Elizabeth is here too.
Welcome. You guys better know me by now.
Exactly. So today's talk will define, we'll go through a few definitions just to make sure everyone's clear on what we're talking about. Then we're going to go through some protein research and then look at the practical strategy of this. Hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. As always, feel free to jump in and voice any questions or concerns you've got, or you can put them in the chat group. Okay, so let's start with a master athlete. I'm pretty sure everyone on the call is considered a master's athlete these days. Is there anyone under 35 on the call? Probably not. So yeah, we're all masters athletes, and I think that's really important that from 35 years of age, you are considered a master's athlete, which I think is pretty remarkable in that sense. In terms of an aging athlete or the older athlete, when they talk about the elderly and the older and the aged athlete, it is a definition of 60 years plus. And I think what's really interesting with that is that, we're certainly seeing a cross-section of athletes that are performing very, very well beyond 60. And I guess what's happening now is the science is trying to catch up to what we're seeing in the field. The literature on the older population is still pretty scant in terms of exactly what the best way is to prevent what we're going to talk about is sarcopenia, and certainly obesity or sarcopenic obesity, which is a major issue in the world today. But what we will be presenting today is, as much of the information we have at our fingertips that can hopefully prevent the onset of sarcopenia and or at least reduce the rate at which it occurs. So I think the important thing about sarcopenia is that, and just in case anyone doesn't understand what that is, it's the effect of it's the involuntary progressive loss of muscle mass, strength, and function as we age. Sarco being muscle, penia being loss, and so sarcopenia being the loss of muscle as we age. As described, and the interesting thing about the master's athlete is once you hit your 3rd decade of living, you start to lose muscle mass, and that rate of decline is around 3 to 8% of muscle mass per decade if you don't do anything about it. So it's not to say you will lose 3 to 8% of your muscle mass, but it is possible if you're probably not looking from a nutritional perspective and optimizing that, and certainly doing exercise or resistance training. You can, by the time you get to your 80s and your 90s, you may have lost 50% of your total muscle mass. Now, if that occurs, significant difficulty and functional deficits are going to occur to you, such as not even being able to walk or get out of a chair. So I think that's really important to consider when we do that. In terms of what sarcopenia or what causes sarcopenia, it's actually not that clear. So it tends to be in the literature and the research talked about as a multifactorial problem in terms of endocrine function, a physical decline. And so what we know about sarcopenia is that certainly, again, nutritional interventions and specific nutritional interventions combined with specific exercise interventions will assist the reduction of that loss of muscle mass as we age. Do you have anything you want to say about that, Elizabeth? Just before we go on. You're okay?
Nope.
I think the other thing we talk about when we talk about like an aging athlete is obviously as we get older, you're going to see reductions or changes in cardiovascular capacity, muscle mass, as we mentioned, changes in tendons, changes in cartilage, and changes in bone mineral density. Now, protein will have an impact on all of these areas, but as we said, today's talk is more about the muscle mass area. Okay, so anabolic resistance. Anabolic resistance is a term used that describes how older people are less sensitive to the anabolic effects of exercise and protein ingestion, and especially essential amino acids. So it's the reduced effect of the protein consumption on what we call muscle protein synthesis that may contribute to this chronic state of sarcopenia, which ultimately is due to a reduced or a negative protein balance state. And it's this negative protein balance state, so i.e. not being in a positive state, but constantly being in a negative state that could contribute to the loss of muscle. So I guess the question is how do we improve that muscle protein balance? And again, that's where hopefully what we discussed today in terms of the research with protein will come into that. So does everyone know what the recommended daily allowance is of protein as a broad guideline? Does anyone have any idea? Considering you do consume a lot more than the daily allowance, I would hope that most of you would be aware of what it is. Does anyone know? Actually, speak up if you do know. I'm always interested. So it's around 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight. And 0.8 grams is very low compared to what majority of you are consuming. So as we'll see, majority of, I think the lowest amount that we will be prescribing for an athlete, and probably due to a fairly severe caloric deficit, would be 1.6 grams. So at least double the World Health Organization recommendation. And for some of you that are on the current body composition program with a focus on that, some of you will be as high as 2.5 grams, which is effectively over 3 times the recommended daily allowance. Now, an example of what the RDA would be from the World Health Organization for a 75 kilo or 165 pound individual would be around 60 grams of protein a day. Now, again, what you're starting to do the math and thinking, well, 60 grams, God, that's nearly as much as I consume sometimes in one meal potentially. And maybe what we should be considering, especially for the older athletes, maybe getting up into that sort of serving per meal. You start to see how the RDA is maybe not specific enough and maybe not tailored enough, not just to athletes, but maybe just to older people in general. And one of the arguments against the RDA is that it's all to do with nitrogen balance, which is how they measure the effect of protein on the body. And the thing about the nitrogen balance is that this is representing the minimum amount of protein to balance nitrogen loss, rather than being the optimal amount to promote the synthesis of new bodily proteins. So in other words, what it's doing is just trying to maintain homeostasis and certainly from a muscle perspective. it's not looking at what can we do to actually try and increase muscle protein synthesis and therefore make gains as we age, as opposed to just maintaining sort of that basic level. And I think that's, again, really important to understand. Last thing I'll talk about is this dietary guidelines for Americans, 2020, 2025. I'd recommend you all have a look at it. It's actually quite comical. And certainly it may explain why 74% of adults in America are either overweight or obese. When you read the guidelines, they're actually quite scary to read. I saw a post by the Mayo Clinic, who I think is very good, but it was talking about, like, is everyone overeating protein? And it cited this dietary guidelines for America, which is ultimately using this World Health Organization 0.8 grams per kilo and saying that 90% of adults are hitting it. And I'm like, well, of course you're hitting it. If it's only 60 grams a day, it's not going to be a problem. So I think it is worth reading. It does talk about the horrific rates of obesity. So adults 60 years plus, there's a 41% rate of obesity. 40% of children, adolescents are overweight and obese. And I think certainly when you look at the guidelines and you look at what's being recommended, you look at the rates of obesity and things like sarcopenia, you start to say, okay, is there something that's going amiss here? And maybe we need to do something about it. Okay, so this is a quote taken from a paper around preventing sarcopenia. And again, I think what we need to think about is the context of a lot of these papers in dealing with aging athletes, again, are looking at the 60 plus population. And I know not all of us are at 60 yet, but I think, look, as I said, we are heading that way. So you want to start to think, okay, what is optimal for a 60-year-old? And should I be doing that maybe if I'm in my 40s, my 50s and heading towards 60? So effectively what they're saying is what I just babbled on about before, is that the RDA is certainly less than optimal. And effectively, to their knowledge, there's never been a study in which the RDA for protein intake was compared with a higher level of protein intake and the RDA was found to be superior in terms of any endpoint. And I think that's the big take-home message here is, if you are consuming more protein than the RDA, you're certainly going to be in a better position. Now, when we get into the specifics of how much you need to consume and what the dose is per meal, that's maybe a different question. And maybe there is some thresholds or some upper ceilings. Maybe there's not, depending on your age, but it's certainly something to consider, is that protein is ultimately going to be very, very important to your ability to maintain lean mass or potentially put on lean mass. E, do you have anything you want to say about that one?
No, I think just the fact that a lot of times we will focus on carbohydrates and the importance of that when we're just talking about endurance athletes and performance. But at the base of this, and our point today, is maintaining muscle mass or even increasing it as we get older. Protein is essential and way more than most people are consuming.
You can do this one.
Question, Scott.
Oh yeah, go. Question.
Is it all absolute grams or percentage of your total caloric intake?
Grams. We'll touch on that now. So if you go by the percentage, this is where people get in real problems with. Was that you, Jerry, who asked that?
No, it was Alexander.
Alexander. So the real problem with going by percentage, and this is where a lot of the studies in nutrition have failed in the past. If you go by percentage, it's going to be dictated by the total amount of calories that you're consuming. So again, we talk about this a little bit later, but if you're on a very low caloric diet, so under, let's even say 1,800 calories, if you have a percentage of that, a majority of the studies have had percentages of somewhere between 10 and 15% of protein of that diet, you're suddenly at 70 or 80 grams of protein. So what you want to be doing, and I was talking to Alan McCubbin about this and the way he, who Alan was on one of our talks, and he's a PhD researcher at Monash, but when he builds his program as well, he actually starts with protein, and we do the same thing. We want to start with giving you grams per kilo for protein and then working sort of all the other macronutrients out around that based on your total training. Because yeah, you want to focus on grams per kilo body weight.
Great question. I think that
it is
because
a very,
when we're looking at macronutrients, I think a lot of us will say, oh, if I'm changing my caloric intake, then do I change protein or one of the others? So I think that was a pretty valid question. When we're looking at protein amounts, that 1.2 grams per kilogram per day, we're finding to stimulate muscle protein synthesis is not enough. It needs to be higher. That at a minimum, and as Scott was saying earlier, is that 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. And then going up to as high as 2.2, 2.7, depending on the kind of work that you're doing, body composition goals. So as you're looking at yours, Fuelin does that for you. However, if you wanted to look at how much you're getting, you definitely want to be hitting and going above that threshold on a consistent daily basis.
And I think one of the really interesting things about the 1.5 grams is that there was a recent systematic review by the group like Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld and whatnot. And it was in relation to lean mass gains in relation to resistance training. And again, it was very focused on muscle, but it wasn't looking. And so everyone was like, oh, you only need 1.6 grams to anything above 1.6 grams per day is not necessarily beneficial in terms of muscle growth. And a lot of this is around muscle building and bodybuilders and gym goers. But it's like, again, that's very muscle focused. And we're not looking at what the net result is for protein synthesis in the rest of the body, because remember that these amino acids are going to facilitate recuperation, recovery, building of every cell in the body. So whilst 1.6 grams per kilo body weight may be optimal for increasing hypertrophy, it may be not necessarily relevant to an endurance athlete who is older, who is doing, all the swimming, the biking, the running. So, and that's also, that's probably the main point, is that whilst 1.6 grams may be seen as an optimal amount for muscular hypertrophy, I still don't think it's enough when you're looking at an endurance athlete who is also trying to either keep body weight off and recover from extensive amounts and a lot of volume of training.
Can there also be too much? I'm a aging triathlete. I'm 60 and a triathlete. It's I consume about 130 to 170 grams of protein per day.
What's your weight, Alex?
I'm 75 kilos, so 165, 167 pounds.
And what are you consuming, did you say?
What I consume between 130 and 160, 170, depending on my training days.
Yeah.
I do use a percentage, so I try to hit about 20%, and I consume on average around 3,000 calories a day, depending again on the training workload.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those ones where, I mean, you certainly, again, like, is there a danger in over consuming protein? Probably if you're hitting 4 or 5 grams per kilo body weight. But even then, there's been studies where they've shown individuals consuming 3.5 to 4 grams with no effect, no negative effects in terms of renal dysfunction. Now, obviously, if you've got one kidney or you do have renal disease, you wouldn't be advised to do that. But what it's saying is that you can certainly go, fairly high in protein consumption without much risk. Majority, again, can you store protein in the body? No. So unlike fat and unlike carbohydrates, there is no storage of protein. It's just going to be used for what it can be used for. And then you're either going to lose it through heat through the body, or you're going to defecate it out. And that's pretty much the take-home message from protein as well.
Okay, thank you.
So this is really interesting. And I think this comes actually probably to the point about the 1.6 grams and like, is that optimal? And then something like what Alex is talking about is that ultimately none of you are in a clinically controlled study. So what you're consuming is going to be based on, the amounts you're consuming are only based on what you are documenting or what you're very good at managing on a day-to-day basis. So that means if you're not super strict in weighing your foods, in documenting, in recording it and that, you could potentially be out either side, maybe 30, 40 grams of protein. Okay. Now, if you're being really strict and saying, oh, I can only get to 1.6 grams per kilo body weight, potentially you're only actually getting 1.2, 1.3 grams because your recording or your tracking isn't that accurate. And therefore you're actually doing yourself a disservice. So when we're prescribing protein, generally we are putting you in a higher bracket, because what we tend to see is majority of athletes struggle to hit that 2.2. So it's probably giving you a little bit of a safe gap in that sense. Now, the other thing to think about is that majority of protein studies are done with fast digesting proteins in the form of whey protein. A majority are not done in mixed meal, real world situations. And I think, again, this is really important because this is going to have an impact on essential amino acids, non-essential amino acids, leucine content and whatnot within the meals. And so what this study went about showing was that as people, there is a threshold for younger people and how much they can consume and what the optimal dose is per meal. So it's somewhere between that 35 and 40 grams, generally speaking. But what they found is people, when they got into the 60, 70, 80 years of age, is that they could actually still benefit from up to 70 grams of protein in a mixed meal form and still see improvements in muscle protein synthesis, which is actually crazy, because I don't know if any of you have tried to eat mixed meal of around 70 grams of protein, but it's a hell of a lot of protein. But just as an example here, if you were going around the 0.6 grams as opposed to the 0.3 grams per kilo of your body weight per meal, a 60 kilo athlete would be consuming around 36 grams per meal. A 70 kilo individual would be now getting into, say, around 42 grams per meal, and an 80 kilo individual would be getting up close to 50 grams per meal. Now, this is obviously specific to the older population, so 60 plus, but it is just something to think about. Now, again, it's not like at 60, you suddenly switch into this like, oh, now I need 0.6 grams. If you're 58, 57, 56, 55, I think what we're saying here is I would be aiming for around 40 grams of protein as a minimum, just to be on the safe side, to ensure that you are at least maximizing out what you're doing per feed and actually getting to your total amounts. That's how I'd be reading this, thinking that you want to be maximizing your overall intake, i.e. 1.6 grams and above per day is your total feed, and then per feed or per dose of protein, probably aiming for at least 40 grams of protein, even if you're in that 60 to 80 kilo mark, which is going to be a hell of a lot of athletes, I'd imagine.
Scott, does the timing of the protein intake have a benefit?
In terms of post-session?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the anabolic window, and again, a lot of this was done in my studies, and they looked at like a 2-hour window versus a 4-hour window. And there's certainly advantages in consuming protein within 2 hours of a meal, but you don't have to consume it within 30 seconds. Your muscles aren't going to drop off. Okay. So as long as you consume, look, if you gave yourself an hour, between an hour and 2 hours, you're going to be fine. That's probably the take-home message. If you could get your mixed meal in, i.e. the optimal dose of protein with the appropriate amounts of fats and carbohydrates in after a training session, then certainly that's going to be advantageous too.
And what about a continuous protein intake? One nutritionist told us once that after a very heavy training session, you have a dose of protein immediately after the workout, fairly quickly, but then on an every hour basis, have a small dose of protein again. Is that something to pay attention to, or does it not really matter in light of what you said earlier?
there seems to be some conflicting research with this. So that was a little bit of like this every 3 hours or whatever you continue to eat the protein. But there is this like a thing called a muscle full effect. So once you max out on the amount of leucine and you hit the threshold for protein dose, you won't necessarily see continued improvements in muscle protein synthesis as you go. So, I think as long as you get in the appropriate dose of protein and you're hitting your total amounts of protein across the day, you're going to be pretty covered. So you certainly don't have to be thinking, oh, I've got to eat every 3 hours. I've got to eat every 3 hours, because you're probably going to have that muscle protein synthesis, or that what we call a fractional synthetic rate, at a very high rate after the initial feed. You sort of max out.
I don't want to disrupt your whole presentation, but another question I had, is there anything that stimulates protein synthesis, any kind of supplement, or is it just the combination of protein, fat, and carbohydrates?
Well, it's protein, actually. So protein's the thing that will stimulate it the most. The leucine content of that protein is very important, and we will touch on that again, but there doesn't seem to be a point of taking too much leucine. So around 3 grams of leucine within that meal is the important thing. Taking more than that amount of leucine doesn't seem to have any increased effect. But then, as I'm touched on here, it's the amount of protein based on your age, that actual dose of protein, which is going to maximize muscle protein synthesis.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's take a look here for female athletes specifically. And this is where we see a lower caloric intake possibly having an effect on muscle protein synthesis and getting in your total protein for the day. So where athletes are already under consuming, and that's less than 1,800 calories a day, which a lot of older masters athletes do, whether that's because they're going through menopause and so they're worried about weight gain, or if that's just they're consuming less to begin with because they don't want to go above a certain mark. That is where we will see deficiencies in protein intake. And this is where it's especially important to remind you that that 1.6 to 2.4 grams, you're not adjusting, like we said earlier, you're not adjusting the percentage of your diet from protein. You're making sure that you hit that 1.6 to 2.4 grams per kilogram per day.
And I think on that, like if we look at that 1,800 number, again, some athletes at the moment who have chosen their focus is on body composition. They're potentially using the time-restricted feeding window, things like that, in conjunction with doing more weights training. That 1,800 calories is certainly, or potentially, not getting hit. So I think it's so important for you to focus on getting that protein amount in whilst you're potentially in a caloric deficit. And whilst we've got this specific to the female athletes, I would say this also applies to the male athletes. So if we're seeing limited amounts of research with females, which unfortunately is the case, but we're seeing this in females, I would extrapolate that and say, well, it's going to relate to males as well. Because anything generally speaking, again, it is specific to females, but I think we're also seeing that in males as well, and certainly older males. The point about the HRT, which I thought was very interesting, and again, if you're in menopause and you're on HRT, it would be interesting to know that if you're the sex hormone binding globulin, if that is high, then potentially you do get reduced free testosterone, and women do have testosterone, by the way, and it is really important for retention of lean muscle mass. But if you are on HRT and you are under the guidance of either a doctor or an endocrinologist, I think it would be fascinating for you to just sort of talk about this, especially if you're struggling with body composition and you're struggling with retention of lean mass. It could be something. So what we'll talk about in a minute with males, older male athletes, is HRT could potentially be really effective in improving or reducing the opportunity of sarcopenia to occur, whereas in women, HRT may actually have the reverse effect and increase the likelihood for sarcopenia to occur. Because of, I think it's, you get increased estradiol with menopause, is that correct?
Yeah.
And reduced amounts of progesterone. I think I'm correct in that. Anyone who's in menopause could probably tell me exactly, but I'm pretty sure that's it. And when you get this reduction in progesterone and increase in estradiol, then that can have this effect once HRT is put in place. So something just to consider, and certainly if you're struggling, then that could be something to think about. Whereas with male athletes, we have this thing called andropause. So 60% of men over 65 years of age will tend to have reduced free testosterone levels compared to their youthful counterparts. Now, again, it's not like at 65, you suddenly flick the switch and you suddenly drop all your T. I think low testosterone levels are being documented in population. I certainly think it's interesting to get tested and look at where does your free testosterone levels sit. If they are very low, if you're displaying other symptoms of maybe reduced mood, reduced energy, reduced libido, things like that. If you haven't had your free testosterone tested, certainly something to consider talking to your doctor about. If it is found to be low, this is where potentially HRT, and there have been some randomized clinical trials to do with this, in the form of using testosterone injections, transdermal patches, and gels. Now, again, I think you'd have to look at, if you are going to go on this type of therapy, I think it excludes you pretty much from competing at the highest level, because certainly under WADA guidelines, testosterone supplementation is not allowed. Now, I'm not saying you go and get juiced up or anything like that. I'm saying from a health perspective, if andropause is present in your life, then there are options to potentially improve your testosterone levels and potentially reduce sarcopenia, the occurrence of sarcopenia from maybe progressing if you are struggling with retention or loss of muscle mass. Something to consider. Again, it would be a discussion with your doctor, it would be a discussion with an endocrinologist, and it would all be monitored very carefully and very appropriately. Betaine, I put a question mark there, and this could be useful for women as well. There's been some interesting studies with the consumption of 2 or 3 grams of betaine, which is otherwise known as trimethylglycine, 2 or 3 grams per day, with improvements in testosterone levels, improvement in muscle soreness, improvements in strength being seen in certain more youthful populations, but certainly something quite interesting. I will put my hand up and say that I am currently in a process of about 20 odd days of betaine supplementation, maybe placebo. Do I feel a lot better? Yeah, I do. Alexander saying he takes it. I don't know if there's something there. I actually have my testosterone levels checked last week. I'm probably going to get those tested again in 60 days time and see if there's any change. And that's the only thing I'm changing in my training or supplement routine. So I'll come back to you if there's any outstanding results.
Scott, I know that it's in food sources also, like wheat bran, quinoa, beets. Potentially that's a benefit for some plant-based athletes, which we'll talk about next. But is it possible to get, do you think, with the food that you eat, or are you finding supplementing to just be easier?
Well, I guess the question is, and again, I don't think in the studies that were investigating the supplementation of betaine, did they account for what their dietary intake was? So I guess what you're saying is this isn't a supplemental amount of betaine to someone's existing diet. I guess it would be a little bit like someone who eats beets all the time. If you go and then supplement them with, say, 400 milligrams of dietary nitrates, would you still see an improvement? Probably.
Yeah.
Same with creatine. Even if you're a meat eater and you're getting all the creatine through that, can you still see benefits by creatine supplementation? Yes. So I guess you're just going probably super loading.
Okay.
In that sense. That's how I'd read it.
Speaking of plant-based athletes, always want to make sure that all of our athletes are included. There are, some benefits for plant-based athletes in terms of the overall diet and health. However, when we're looking at protein, it's a very big concern that our plant-based athletes are getting enough. So I want to make sure to address kind of some key points. And in plant-based athletes, because plant-based proteins most of them do not have all of the essential amino acids, because the digestibility of certain plant-based proteins is lower. As a plant-based athlete, you want to aim higher. You're looking at that 1.8 to 2.7 grams per day. So if you are a plant-based athlete, again, not just you kind of have to go that third step above. We've talked about athletes going the second step above. So there's RDA, and then there's what we say for athletes, and then what we say for aging athletes. Well, plant-based aging athletes have an even higher threshold that you want to make sure that you're hitting. The quality and quantity is important. As I said, because of poor digestibility, because of having to look at if you are balancing caloric intake, carbohydrate intake. A lot of plant-based protein sources are higher in carbohydrates, and so that's going to increase daily calories. Some of them are higher in fat as well. So if you are looking to increase protein intake, there are multiple factors that you have to consider. And so quality and quantity. It's not just about getting as much in. As Scott and I have talked about, leucine being the primary trigger for MPS, recovery, adaptation. Plant-based protein sources are not known for having high leucine content. And that's where either supplementing or making sure, if you're doing a plant-based protein powder, that they've included leucine in it. A lot of the better plant proteins now include that. And this is where we've talked before about creatine supplementation, the importance of that for feeling good, for feeling strong, and being able to notice changes and being able to get through strength sessions and preserve or improve muscle mass. Plant-based athletes will feel a stronger benefit from taking creatine. So just extra considerations as a plant-based athlete.
Did you want to say anything about the beta-alanine?
Oh, studies have shown for men specifically a benefit when taking beta-alanine as well for plant-based athletes in terms of keeping testosterone levels high and improving muscle mass. Female studies, not so much.
There we go. So what will protein do? It will provide you with a foundation for muscle protein synthesis, okay? And that's obviously going to help with retention and potential growth of lean tissue. As we talked about, that protein net balance, we don't want it going into a catabolic state. We want it staying in an anabolic state, or at least not going into a negative state. It can potentially assist with tendon repair. It certainly improves satiation, and it can increase energy expenditure through the thermic effect of protein. As I said, if you're taking in excessive amounts of protein, the thermic effect of protein is the highest out of all the macronutrients, being protein, carbohydrates, then fat. What is important to understand about protein is that if you take in protein, that's not the optimal dose. It's probably not going to have a real effect on you. It is not going to help you unless you have a stimulus applied to it in conjunction with it. So in the studies, especially with aging athletes, and one of the studies is referenced here, is that, and that's a systematic review and meta-regression analysis, But if you do not apply protein with the appropriate training stimulus, you will not see improvements in lean mass or muscle mass retention. So that is very important. So it's not going to, just consuming protein and large amounts of protein is not going to guarantee muscle growth, and you're certainly not going to become the Hulk regardless of that. Okay, so it is very important. While protein is really cool, it is not the singular thing that is going to suddenly make you a superhuman, and certainly not a better triathlete. You
Got a
need
question.
to do the work. You need to do the training involved with that. Sorry, Alex.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Does the type of training, the type of stimulus have an impact? Does, say, when you're cycling at a higher power output, doing intervals and all that, have more of an impact than when you have more of a recovery type training? Same thing with running or swimming with paddles, have more of an impact than just a recovery type of swim? Or does it not matter? Training is training.
No, so the optimal stimulus. So we're talking about stimulus for muscle growth, it's weights training. Yeah. We're talking about resistance training when we're talking about muscle growth. Now, cycling at a very high intensity or very high resistance potentially, I guess, could help with muscular strength, but it's probably going to be more muscular endurance. What we're talking about specifically here is using resistance training to increase lean muscle mass.
Just strength training.
Strength training.
Okay.
Okay. Fortifying food strategy. I think this is probably one that I get asked a lot about, and athletes are always asking, like, how much protein powders can I use, or how much should I have per day? Now, I think there's two parts to this question. I think if you're a very light athlete, certainly no more than one, serving of protein powder should be your dose per day. If you're a heavier athlete and struggling to hit your protein amounts, then I think there is the argument for potentially fortifying your foods by using things like leucine, essential amino acids, or a whey protein or a plant-based protein. And when we talk about fortifying, so don't go and buy high protein cereals. Don't go buy high protein milks. It's a waste of time, waste of money. Just use a protein powder, whether it be a whey protein isolate or a mixed plant protein, and then mix that into whatever you're doing. So protein yogurt, when I say homemade, get some Greek yogurt, Chobani. That's what I use. It's got, in 200 grams, what's 200 grams? It's about 7 ounces, I think. 7 ounces, I think, is 200 grams. Get that. You'll get, what did I say? I looked at it, 20 grams of protein in that sort of serve. Mix in 1 scoop of protein, you've got 42 grams or 45 grams of protein in that single meal. Boom. You're already well on your way to hitting most of your target for the day. Same with protein overnight oats. If you've got some Greek yogurt in it, some of the oats are going to have some protein. Mix in an appropriate amount, so probably 1 to 1.5 scoops of protein into that. You're suddenly at 40 grams of protein in that. Same for protein, waffles, pancakes, muffins. We talked about the vegetarian vegan element before, but if you're a vegetarian, consider using, and again, depending how strict you are, if you're happy to eat fish, then certainly blending some of those fish proteins with plant protein sources is important. And then, as Elizabeth said, if you are a strict vegan, you should be looking to consume multiple sources of protein. It's always one of those arguments that meat eaters have, a carnivore diet people will have against like vegans, is that, they're incomplete. They're incomplete sources of amino acids. Well, just eat a pea protein with a brown rice protein and you're going to get all your amino acids. But to Elizabeth's point, you have to eat more of them. And that's really important because the bioavailability of those proteins isn't always as good. The leucine content may not be as high. You will have to eat more of those plant-based products to get the appropriate amounts of protein. And in doing so, you have to consider that majority of those proteins will have higher amounts of carbohydrates and fat, and that could then push you into a caloric surplus. So it is a consideration to have. As exampled here, though, think about consuming things like maize and soybean, rice, pea, brown rice. And that relates to protein powders as well. So if you are a vegan or a vegetarian athlete using a plant-based protein powder, use one that is multiple sources of protein. So if you think of the True Protein Vegan 85, it is rice, pumpkin, and pea protein powders, which will provide you with a complete amino acid profile, something important. If you're a plant-based athlete, again, to what Elizabeth was saying, consider maybe just topping up a little bit of leucine in those meals. There's been some cool studies where they had vegetarians, vegans. I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but they had them fortifying their foods with 3 grams per meal per day. And that had significant improvements in terms of retention and increases in lean mass in those vegan athletes. And then, yeah, if you have a suboptimal meal with suboptimal protein, potentially fortifying it with essential amino acids or leucine could be a way of improving that poor quality protein feed. Another question I often get is about like, well, how do I work out how much I need? Or when I look at the program, okay, we've got the carb colors mapped out, but what about the protein? So what I tried to do is create a little equation. So effectively, you'll look at your total protein per day. Then what you want to do is you want to minus 1 shake from that. Divide it by the total meals in the day that you're being prescribed minus 1 shake. So what does that look like? So 140 grams of protein across the day. We know that 1 shake has 40 grams of protein, and that 1 shake and 3 meals are being provided. So then it's 140 grams of protein across the entire day minus the protein of the shake. Oh, my math is terrible. Sorry, it should be 100. Should say 100, they're not 110. Divided by the 4 meals across the day, that's including the shake, minus 1, which is the shake. So you get 100 divided by 3, which is 33 grams per meal. Okay, so in your main meals, you would be aiming for 33 grams of protein plus 1 shake of 40 grams. And that's how you want to be working it out. So just count the total number of main meals, minus, and one of those, and then you'll have a snack as a shake, minus that out from it, and you'll be able to roughly work out what you should be aiming for in terms of protein per meal. Now, I've got a little asterisk there because what I said is potentially if you then average that out, or if you think about what we talked about, if you're over 60, maybe you might be better off doing 2 40-gram meals with a shake, which is again another 40 grams, and then maybe late in the evening, maybe having a 20-gram meal. So at least you've maximized muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. You go into maybe having a lighter meal at night, which may help you with sleep as well. So something to consider. And then in terms of what does that look like, what would roughly 33 grams per meal look like? As it says here, around 4 ounces, 120 grams, or about 2/3 of a hand of, chicken, turkey, beef. Same for fish. Think of things like canned fish, packets of fish. They're very convenient, easy to take away. And then from the plant perspective, things like yogurt, 3 cups of yogurt, 1.5 cups of cooked pulses, 1.5 cups of firm tofu or tempeh. So you then start to build out your meals in terms of that sense. Does anyone have any questions relating to that, apart from my terrible maths? Sorry. Okay. Hey.
This is just a reminder of when you're looking for a protein powder, since it's pretty much essential for us as athletes and aging athletes, looking at protein type, grams per serving, that can change. You'll hear us say, put a scoop into your shake. Well, that scoop could be 20 grams from one source, or sometimes some of them have as much as 30 or as low as 12 to 15. So you really need to be mindful of the serving size, reminding you that we don't want added ingredients or fillers. We want to make sure that they're NSF, Informed Sport, or HOSTA certified. You want to look for one of those logos. And again, where your protein is coming from. Here in the States, like just going to Costco and grabbing the big tub with like the red lettering on it, not always a great idea. Obviously true. Momentous, Garden of Life, Vega, you know, find one that you like and that you are going to take consistently and that you're going to be able to incorporate into your daily diet. That's important. And then looking, does it meet all of these qualifications?
Okay, key messages. That's not me, by the way. Your RDA, the RDA prescribed by the World Health Organization is to keep you alive. It's not to make you optimal. So let's just disregard that for the time being until the science catches up and the research and the legislation catches up. Let's just know that you want to be consuming at least 1.6 to anywhere up to 2.5 grams per kilo body weight. As a rough guideline, regardless if you're young or old, you're aiming for somewhere between that 35 to 40 grams based per meal. Now, obviously, if you're over 60, you could consider going higher, and then it's going to be based on the total amount of protein throughout the day. I think the other important thing is that in terms of what we're providing to you, you know, you're thinking about your total caloric intake as well. If you are on a lower calorie, that higher amount of protein becomes even more important. Protein alone is not enough, as described before. You certainly need to consider what the stimulus is in your training. If you're looking at increasing lean muscle because you've had a reduction in that and maybe over time tracking through something like a DEXA, you notice that lean muscle mass is reducing, then you need to consider, you know, the training stimulus around that. And that is going to be resistance training. I think being creative with your intake strategies is important. Things like fortifying your food can be a really effective way of getting in that total of protein amount per feed and also total amounts across the day. And then it's all about being consistent, okay? The idea of drinking a shake after a session and that's going to be enough is just complete BS. It's all about, it's like everything with this, it's the consistency in using the system that is going to make the difference. So if you are consistent with your protein intake in terms of the dose per feed and the total amount across the day, and you're doing that day in, day out, week after week, month after month, that is going to have a positive impact on your health and performance. Questions?
I have another question, Scott. It's as the stimulus is important for protein intake, and you have the daily protein intake, but as an endurance athlete, you're not going to do strength training, resistance training on a daily basis. At least as a triathlete, I don't have much training to give as that. It's about 2 in the winter, maybe 3 sessions per week. Does that mean that the days that I don't have that type of training, I don't get the right impact from protein intake?
No. So 2 to 3 strength trainings. I mean, you're not, you know, if you look at strength training, like a two sessions a week would be the minimum effective dose, but certainly 3 strength training sessions a week is going to be more than enough. You don't need to be training every single day to create muscle.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Jordan. I know there was a mess up with all the information and the emails were about it being about protein. So sorry about that. Is there anything else? Any other questions at this point? Taryn, did you have any questions? Yeah.
So.
Does it all make sense?
Yeah.
How's your experience been with increasing your protein intake?
It's hard to get it in, and I find I'm doing 2 shakes, sometimes 3 in a day just to get it all in. But I think those are days when I'm not being as cognizant about what I'm doing.
And do you use those fortifying methods?
Well, so the protein powder that I use doesn't seem to bake really well, so I haven't done it I've tried it a few times unsuccessfully.
Yep.
So no, I guess. Short
And
answer.
what about things like fortifying, like cereals or yogurts and things like that? Have you tried that method?
I've never tried to mix protein in with a yogurt before. So
It's very good.
there's a soy yogurt that I use that's like a 15 grams of carbohydrate, or excuse me, of protein in it. Yeah. But it has never once occurred to me to mix protein powder in with that. So I'll have to give that a try.
Yeah, I'd certainly give that a go. It's probably my go-to if I need to increase protein in the morning, if it's not an overnight oats. Then I'd certainly use that, and it's very good. I use, again, I'm very bound to True in terms of just its flavor profile, but I'll use either the strawberries and cream, the coconut, or the French vanilla. And, you do that 3 times in a week, you're sort of having 3 different flavored yogurts, and it's quite nice. The banana and honey is very good as well. So
that would be good. I actually do have a question about True, and I don't know if this is too specific to ask, but for their vegan protein, there's a straight up vegan, and then there's a vegan pasta, I think it is, or vegan. And actually Elizabeth used that word too, but I don't know what the difference is. And when I've read the profile, they seem to be the exact same product.
Same product, just tested for banned substances. So HASTA, Informed Sport, and NSF for Sport means that the product is batch tested for banned substances. So from a recommendation standpoint, I think every athlete should be consuming products that have that stamp on them. Okay. Certainly in America, I would be very aware of this, knowing how Wild West the supplements world is, and it's getting worse in Australia as well, although we're fairly tightly regulated in what people can do. But certainly you should be consuming products that either have the Informed Sport. The HASTA regulation is one in Australia and New Zealand, so you won't see that unless you're buying an Australasian or New Zealand product. But Informed Sport you will see through Europe and through America, and then NSF for Sport is a North American sort of regulation. Yeah,
NSF I knew. HASTA, I didn't know what that was.
Yeah, you'll only see HASTA in sort of the Southern Hemisphere.
Okay. I did try sardines.
It does. Oh, you had sardines?
They were not bad. I had to doctor them up a lot, but there was, go sardines. But there was a lot of protein in that little can. There's a lot of protein. I tell you the other one, smoked oysters. Have you ever had a can of smoked oysters? Has anyone ever had smoked oysters? A can of smoked oysters? The best thing to travel with. Just buy cans of smoked oysters, travel with them. Is it better than like the raw oysters that are just the slimy, nasty mess going down?
Well, I like normal oysters as well. So, but yeah, you can. I would certainly everyone have a go at smoked oysters. John West smoked oysters. They're very good travel pack. I buy them. There you go. Who's that? Who said that? Sally did. She buys them by cases. That's so good. How do I eat them? I just eat them out of the can. I literally, like, Mel, my girlfriend, will be like, "You're so weird," because I eat canned fish all the time. So I'll eat like smoked oysters out of the can. They're very good on crackers though, Anne-Marie. Yeah, with a toothpick out of the can, or I just use a fork. But they're delicious on little those rice crackers. If you want to put them on something. They're little hors d'oeuvres. You go to expensive functions and they'll often be serving little smoked oysters on crackers. So very good. I do enjoy them. They're a good little hack for if you're traveling and can't find anything decent. Salmon slices in can is very good as well. I tend to eat those if I'm struggling. I often just go into a convenience store and look in the canned food section. So I'll tend to do things like that. And it's very good because it gives you omega-3s as well. So, you're doubling up. It will have a little bit more fat, but it's not too bad. What else? I don't know. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I have a question.
Oh yeah, who's that? Who's that?
That's me, it's Carolina.
Hi.
You were talking about roughly 33 grams of protein per meal. Even older athletes or pre-menopause, does it mean that if we consume more than that, the body is not going to be able to digest it, or the cells are not going to be able to synthesize that protein, and it will be converted into fat? It will be stored as fat?
No.
What happens if we go over? We know that if we go over on carbohydrates than what the body or the muscles or the liver already has, it's going to be stored. How about protein?
No, so I was just giving an example of someone.
I was just giving.
Sorry, can you just put your microphone on mute?
Just put your microphone on mute.
Sorry.
No, so I was just giving an example of someone who, I think it was a 65 kilo individual consuming 140 grams of protein and working out the dosage. As I explained in the slides, certainly for older athletes, you probably should be aiming for around that 35 to 40 grams. If you're over 60, you could consider going higher than that. Now, obviously, it's dependent on your total protein amount that you're going to be consuming per day. And as a Fuelin athlete, the minimum amount you're going to be prescribed is 1.6 grams per kilo body weight, anywhere up to 2.5 grams per kilo body weight. So the 33 grams was just an example of someone, how they might split up their day. But generally speaking, you're probably going to be aiming for a little bit higher than that. In terms of protein being stored as fat, it's such a difficult process that it's just not going to happen. Again, you're either going to lose it through heat in the body, or you're going to literally go to the toilet and get rid of it. And even the process of turning carbohydrates into fat is so overplayed. You're probably going to just store them in the liver and the muscle first and foremost, before you even get close to storage. It's going to be storage of fat that you're not utilizing because of the way the body prioritizes utilization of fuel substrates. That's going to be the bigger problem. Hence why when athletes go on a lower fat diet, potentially even with higher carbohydrate, they'll see reductions in body composition. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else? I can't see everyone again. I'm not sure why, but does anyone else have any other questions? It's all good. Okay. Well, look, I think hopefully it's solidified a lot of the information we've given in the past about protein and its importance for endurance athletes, and made it even more relevant as we age, the importance of protein and how it can actually have a very positive impact, I think, on health as much as performance. Because ultimately, if you lose lean muscle mass, you then go down the route of things like insulin resistance, because muscle is going to be the most potent, is going to have the most potent impact in terms of insulin resistance. You develop type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. It's just a cascade into poor health. And then I think from a performance standpoint, the more muscle you have, the more power you can produce, and therefore the faster you can go. So I think from both aspects, thinking of muscle, thinking of protein, it's certainly beneficial to you as an endurance athlete, and something that you should all be considering to consume in certainly higher amounts than what the RDA is. Cool. Well, if there's no further questions, then thank you, Mickey. Yeah, we'll call it a day, and I look forward to hearing from all of you sometime in the near future. See you guys. Bye-bye.